Thank you, distinguished panelists. The question my presentation seeks to answer is if the criteria to receive reparations is based on one's lineage and descent from American chattel slavery, how do you successfully identify persons who descend from this system using genealogy? To answer, we will discuss what genealogy is and how it is used, what it means to be classified as African American and descend from the system of American chattel slavery, laws that shaped immigration affecting African Americans across the diaspora, the 5 generations of enslaved Africans, who to expect to find in your research, the generations that exist today and their proximity to an enslaved ancestor. In the end, I will show you a visual tutorial on how to conduct genealogy research using FamilySearch.org, a completely free website. Genealogy is defined, next slide please. Genealogy is defined as the tracing of lines of descent. A genealogist then is someone who traces or studies lines of family descent. Professional genealogists apply the genealogy proof standard to every research assignment, to which there are 5 components: reasonably exhaustive research, complete and accurate source citations, thorough analysis and correlation, resolution of conflicting evidence, soundly written conclusion based on the strongest evidence. With the modern availability of research tools, all of us can apply these standards to personal research projects using websites like FamilySearch.org. If we have time, I can point out how the standards were used in the visual example. When applying genealogy to an assignment like this one, it is important to consider the question and the many ways the question can be answered. First, we must define what it means to be African American. For the sake of this discussion, African Americans are those involuntarily brought to the United States for the purpose of being enslaved. Using genealogy to prove descendancy from this group would involve tracing one's lineage back to either a person enslaved in this system or a time when there was little to no presence of legal voluntary immigration from African or Caribbean countries. While the system of slavery existed, there were no immigrants from either African or Caribbean countries coming to the United States voluntarily. The 1790 Naturalization Act stated only white men from Western European countries living in the United States for 2 years were able to become citizens. This act was expanded in 1870 to include Africans. The Reed-Johnson Immigration Act of 1924 implemented national origins quotas. The quotas provided visas to 2% of the total number of people from each nationality in the US as of the 1890 census. This quota allowed for just 1,200 people from the African continent to immigrate to the United States by 1925. In contrast, tens of thousands of Caribbeans matriculated to the United States between 1910 and 1930. Therefore, tracing an ancestor back to the early 1900s, living anywhere in the country, would prove descent from American chattel slavery, since the only Africans that were here were the ones brought involuntarily, if unable to identify an enslaved ancestor by name. A survey of census data at the time also showed there to be a negligible number of voluntary immigrants to the African diaspora living in the South prior to the Great Migration of 1910 through 1940. Therefore, tracing one's ancestry to the southern United States prior to the Great Migration of 1940 would also prove that one descends from American chattel slavery, even if not being able to identify an enslaved ancestor by name. Because freedom came in waves. Oh, if you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Because freedom came in waves during slavery, depending on the state you were enslaved or the interpersonal relationship with an enslaver, one's descendancy from American chattel slavery may connect you with one of 5 generations of enslaved persons, as described in Professor Ira Berlin's book, Generations of Captivity. The first generation is the charter generation. This represents the 1600s during the colonial period. 1 in 5 enslaved persons were able to negotiate their freedom during this time. The plantation generation represents the late 1600s to early 1800s. This is when the system of plantation slavery was very robust and completely developed. Slaves worked harder and died younger during this period. So it's pretty difficult to trace ancestry back to this period, but it is possible if your ancestors were freed early on during slavery. The revolutionary generations represent late 1700s to early 1800s. The North abandoned slavery at this time. Slave rebellions more frequent and violent. Slave laws become strict in the South. Enslaved identify home as Africa and not individual tribes during this time. The migration generation, 1810 to 1861, is the second Middle Passage, and this is when slaves were moving deeper into the South from areas like Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. In a research assignment, you more than likely will back into someone from this generation of slavery. And the last generation is the Freedom Generation. That is between 1861 and 1890. And these are those enslaved persons that were freed because of the Civil War and lived post-Civil War. And if you can go to the next slide. Lastly, before watching the tutorial, depending on the generation you are in now, will determine just how far removed you are from an enslaved ancestor. Those in the World War II generation, up to the Gen X generation, there is a separation from an enslaved ancestor as little as 1 to 3 generations removed. If tracing back to the 1940 census, the millennials up through Gen Z need only identify a grandparent or great-grandparent and are within 4 to 6 generations of an enslaved ancestor. Next slide, please. So I believe, yes. And so the proving eligibility, one of 3 ways. The first is identifying an enslaved ancestor by name, and that's an African-American ancestor born in the South prior to 1865. The second is identifying an ancestor living in the United States prior to 1900. That is, African-American ancestor can live anywhere in the United States prior to this date because of the lack of voluntary African and Caribbean immigration to the United States. And the third is identifying an ancestor or family member, because we're talking about the 1940s. Many of those people are still living today, living in the South prior to the Great Migration of 1940. And so if you go to the next slide, I demonstrate how to search for an enslaved ancestor using FamilySearch.org. I used FamilySearch.org because it is a completely free site. They have over 8 billion records, and it is run by the Church of Latter-day Saints, which also has 5,000 in-person brick-and-mortar resource centers spread across the country if you needed to get help tracing your lineage. So if you can begin the tutorial, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to take you through a brief tutorial on how to conduct this research yourself. And I have chosen FamilySearch.org, which is the completely free genealogy website that has over 8 billion records for you to choose from. So let's get started. We'll go to Records, and I'm choosing my deceased grandmother, Mittie, as the example. Mittie, last name Morrow. She was born in Greene County, Alabama in 1919. Immediately, we are able to see that she shows up in the 1930 census, living in Mantua, Greene, Alabama, and her birth year is 1918. So she's 12 years old in this record, and what we want to do is find someone a little older than she is, even though this record would satisfy the eligibility requirements because she is living in the South prior to 1940. But let's go and view the original document. So down below it lists that she is a daughter in this household, which means that that is her relationship to the head of household. So we should expect to see a father, and I will expand this so that you can see the actual census record. And lo and behold, here is her father, Percy Morrow, listed as head of household. So since we found Percy, and let's look at some details about Percy. Oh, too far. Let's highlight him. So he is born 1896 in Alabama, and he's living in Mantua, Greene County, Alabama, so we're going to put that in our next set of search criteria for Percy. Greene County, 1896. Excellent. So the first record that shows up is Percy, except for it has his birthday as November 1894. All of the birth dates are estimates at this point in history. So we see here that Percy is 6 years old in this record. And let's scroll down. And let's see. He is born in Alabama. The relationship to head of household is grandson. So we actually are able to go back in time and see someone who is possibly a member of the Freedom Generation. We have grandmother here, Harriet Morrow. She is born October 1841, and let's see. And she's born in North Carolina. This shows that she has 4 living children and that she's been married for 25 years, and that both her mother and her father are also born in North Carolina. This record would actually serve to indicate that I descend from enslaved ancestry, because here in the 1900 record, we didn't have to go back to 1870, we see that we bump into an enslaved ancestor, Harriet Morrow. And we know that she is enslaved because North Carolina is a slave state. She is black. She was born in 1841 in North Carolina, which we can pretty much assume that she was enslaved during that period of time. So that is our proof standard, but we will just look at the original record, open this up. And let's find them here. Let's see. Down, and here she is. So Harriet Morrow is the head of household, and this is them down here. Harriet Morrow, his mother, her daughter, Teely, her son, Lonnie, which is Percy's uncle, and his brother, Eddie. So this is his household, and this record would prove that the family descends from American chattel slavery. Thank you.